The best-selling comic series in the world is One Piece. But the second best-selling, with almost 400 million copies sold, is neither British nor American. It is, in fact, the story of a small French village holding out against the Roman Empire. In this episode, we're going to look at the history and cultural impact of Asterix the Gaul. Hello, my name is Gareth Edwards and welcome to the Untitled History Podcast. Join me each week alongside world-leading experts as we take a deep dive into your favourite topics from throughout history. From the ancient world to the modern, and with plenty of historical rabbit holes in between, we'll cover famous and not so famous moments in history from all across the globe. The year is 50 BC. Gaul is entirely occupied by the Romans. Well, not entirely. One small village of indomitable Gauls still holds out against the invaders. And life is not easy for the Roman legionaries, who garrison the fortified camps of Totorum, Aquarium, Laudanum and Compendium. So starts the adventures of Asterix, Obelix and friends in almost every English translation. Adventures that have sold 393 million copies over 65 years of continuous publication. Adventures that have been turned into some of the earliest audiobooks, into films, games, theme parks and more. Yet beneath that success lies a remarkable story of a French-Jewish writer and an Italian immigrant writing about the history and foibles of the country they both loved and called home, and of France trying to rebuild its national myth and economy in the aftermath of German occupation and the horrors of war. And to help me explore that topic to here today is Julie Kalman. Julie, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here.
So, for those unfamiliar with her work, Julie is Professor of History at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. She is a French historian who is interested in the history of nationalism and migration. And listeners, the clue as to why I particularly wanted Julie on the show for this one comes in the book she is currently working on, which the book, provisionally titled Asterix and the Making of Modern France, which is her fifth book, is about exactly the stuff we're going to talk about today. So thank you so much for coming on.
My pleasure. Always happy to talk about Asterix.
So we'll get into some of its impact and why this is fascinating from a historical perspective, not just from a literary historical perspective in a bit. But I almost feel like we should start this show by talking about how we both came to Asterix. So I came to Asterix as a kid, as I think a lot of British kids did. I always think that there's an entire generation of archaeologists and historians who are the product of two things, which is reading Asterix books when you're small, and then watching Time Team on TV as you get older. And so my earliest memories of things like the first book that I ever remember owning was Asterix and Cleopatra, which I bought with book tokens that I thought covered the entire cost, but didn't. My mum was actually topping it up so that I could buy an Asterix books because I read them at school in the library. So that was my first encounter, and that got me hooked forever. What was your first encounter with Asterix?
Well, so I was born and grew up in Melbourne, which is a long, long way from Europe, but I'm the child of immigrants. And my mother actually was born in Belgium, which of course is the heart of, or has long been the heart of, French language comics. It certainly was in the beginning. And there were always Tintins and Asterixes in the house. I had older siblings, so they were already there for me. And any day I was off sick, I would take the entire pile of Asterixes, put them by the bed and just read through them over the course of the day. I studied French at school because that was the only foreign language that was offered. There was one volume in French, and I remember the very first pun that I understood and the enormous pleasure that came with that. So I've been hooked also for a very long time.
And what I love about both our descriptions there, and this will come up in the show, I suspect, is they both absolutely map onto the stories of the creators and also what the creators loved doing and why these books clearly hit with everyone. And included, when I say creators, I include within that the legendary English translators who we'll talk about as well. But maybe, Julie, do you mind setting the scene for a bit? And I feel like, before we talk about how Asterix as a book series, as a comic series, it becomes a book series, comes into being. We can't separate that from the stories of their creators, can we?
True. So they're a duo. René Goscinny was the author. Albert Uderzo was the illustrator. So Goscinny was the child of Polish Jewish immigrants to France. He was born in 1926. And when he was 2 years old, his father got a job in Argentina. His father was a chemist. They all basically up sticks and moved there. And this is what saved them, because the rest of the family in France were wiped out during the war. So Goscinny spends his childhood, he goes to the French high school in Argentina, in Buenos Aires. After his father dies in 1943 and he leaves school, there's an uncle in New York who says, come and I'll find work for you. So he goes to New York. He just wants to make people laugh. He draws. He's not a bad artist. So he's basically going around trying to sell his comics. Meets Harvey Kurtzman, of course, one of the founders of Mad magazine, and they maintained a friendship over many years. Does his military service in France, so he's very attached to France, and then kind of gets into those circles of comic writers. That's the time when he meets Morris, who is the illustrator of Lucky Luke. And Goscinny becomes the author. So Goscinny wrote many of the Lucky Luke comics also. And he meets a fellow called Georges Troisfontaine. George, Three Fountains is the translation of his name. Troisfontaine is trying to build a publishing empire in Brussels. And he says offhand to Goscinny, yeah, if you're ever in Brussels, look me up. And Goscinny takes that as an invitation. So a year or so later, he lands in Brussels. Troisfontaine is very surprised to see him. But Troisfontaine is setting up a business called the World's Press, a very grand name, which is going to supply content to magazines, comics and columns. And he's setting up a Paris office on the Champs-Élysées. So he's making a statement. And he sends Goscinny there. That's where Goscinny meets Uderzo.
Well, let's dig a bit into Goscinny first and his background in that regard, because I think it's so interesting, some of the things you've touched on there. Like, and I think this is very much in the spirit of Asterix, is in true British style, I'm going to absolutely mangle every French word and name I say in this, which I feel he'd really find is appropriate, given what Asterix in Britain does in its own native translation. But I really like the story of him because he's so very French. He is distinctly French and has a tragically early death as well, which we'll talk about in a bit. But as you've described here, even he is on the immigrant journey. He goes to Argentina, he spends his time in New York, and he comes back. When he serves in the army, actually, he's in the Alpine Infantry Battalion. I mean, obviously only for a year because it's national service. But his journey, in a way, is actually very, very similar in many aspects to what a lot of French people will have, or those who come from abroad. And as you say, he studies French and he goes to a French school in Argentina. And it's very clear to me from all I've looked into and studied on him that he sees himself as very, very French. He genuinely loves France as much as part of this. There's no question in his mind that he's not French, even though he spends time in New York and elsewhere. And I kind of feel like that really comes through in his later work or across the board.
I think we can think of him as an expat. The family moves to Argentina in 1928, and every 3 years they take a cruise back to France to see family. So he has this connection. The last time they go is 1940, and they see family for the last time in the free zone, and then leave and spend the war in Argentina. You know, he learns the French canon, all the old works that Racine, Molière, at school in France. So he's getting a French education. So yes, he absolutely sees himself as French by nationality, if you like.
And you also touched on there that he does befriend Harvey Kurtzman. And that, I feel, is also like he is a joker. He likes making people laugh, as you say. He does that as a kid. He does that all through his life. And I've always loved the touching points you get when people encounter people, creative people encounter other creative people. And I think you can see why those two would get on. Like, they have a very similar sense of humor. And you can see actually some of that come through in Asterix. You can see that come through in Mad Magazine. And we'll talk a bit about the US translations a bit later, which in a way almost don't capture that spirit that both men get. But yeah, like, I just want listeners, you've got to understand that. I think Expat's a great description of him. That kind of, it almost makes him love the country more maybe than if he sees it for what it is. He sees it as both an outsider and an insider. And I think that absolutely comes through in Asterix when it comes to publishing. But yeah, I mean, let's talk a bit about Uderzo, because his origin is both similar and different. So he is a child to Italian parents. He moves to Paris in 1927. But his experience of growing up in France is different to Goscinny's, isn't it?
Yes. So he spends his childhood in Paris, large family, relatively poor. He cops a lot of racism in the interwar period. There was a lot of anti-Italian racism, and there was this sense as you know, the kind of anti-immigrant playbook that these Italians were coming and taking jobs. But also from 1933 onwards, of course, there's the fascist regime. So he experiences a lot of that. He is an absolutely wildly talented artist. He can draw anything. And the sign of that is how young and early he gets a job as an illustrator. But one of the things that I think is really interesting for me about this story is how these two figures, who in a way we can think of as peripheral to French culture, see right through to the centre. And this is an aspect of the story for me that I'm really interested to explore.
Yeah, I the more I looked into the background of both men, the more that really does shine through. It is that they're viewing it from both the outside and the inside simultaneously, and then they've experienced or can see its negatives, but they can also see the absolute strength of French culture, of what makes it tick and what makes it work. And clearly, because both men are so talented in various ways, is that they're just laser focused on that. They pick that out in a way that few other authors have done, but they do it in such a unique and interesting way that we'll see through all their work together, not just through Asterix, although Asterix is almost the culmination of that. So, and I didn't realize until I started digging into it, Uderzo was colorblind. Like, so he didn't do most of the inking for the comics. Yeah, his brother did it. So actually, there's two Uderzos involved in this. Is that I think it's Marcel, is it? Is his brother that does a lot of the coloring? But yeah, I mean, and before we talk about how they came together and anything else, just to really capture how much they come to represent French culture and are accepted and appreciated for doing so. I mean, Uderzo gets the Légion d'honneur like in 2013, and you have to suspect that Goscinny would have got it as well if he was still alive.
One of the parts of this book is really the story of the national grief that overcomes people on the announcement of Goscinny's sudden death. And the headlines that you see across the whole kind of range of newspapers in France, the profound shock that people experience, it's extraordinary.
Well, before we get to the sad bit,
spoiler
let's talk about the fun bit. So as you said, like, listeners, to put you back into context here, it's 1951-ish. World press is a thing. Goscinny has the one thing I love about this. If you go on Wikipedia, listeners, and you look at the story of this is your classic Wikipedia thing. If you look at the story of how two people meet or how they come together, it's always very a fait accompli. It's always presented as if it's this thing that was just inevitably going to happen. And if you read the accounts on there about how Goscinny gets his job at World Press, it's very much presented as, oh yeah, he was made this official offer, and then he went over, And he obviously accepted the offer and all of that. And as you've described, Julie, it's far more, he turns up and it's like, I wasn't necessarily serious about that offer, but now you're here. I know you're talented, so yes. So always remember that, listener, that when you're reading things on Wikipedia, it is genuinely very accurate. It doesn't always tell the entire story, and that's why we love recording podcasts. But so, yeah, they effectively meet in 1951 while working at World Press, don't they?
Yes, in the Paris offices. They're employed separately as illustrator script writers, and they're in this fairly bare office. They call their headquarters the cafe downstairs, and they have sloping desks, so a sort of artist's sloping desk opposite each other. Uderzo really liked to draw, and that was his preference, and Goscinny worked out that actually his preference was writing script. And very quickly they form a friendship, and they are extremely close friends right through their lives. And Goscinny describes the kind of the way the friendship develops. He says that it was almost telepathic, the way they could communicate. And I think that you see that in Asterix. The extraordinary, you could look at this and imagine it was done by one person. The extraordinary coming together of text and image.
You're right. There's a synchronicity to their work. There's times, you see this sometimes with creative people, where someone else is just entirely on the same wavelength, and everything they create together just becomes almost the finisher of another person's thoughts. This is, I think, why you see so many successful comedy writing duos. So, I mean, modern terms for listeners, Rob Grant and Doug Naylor are two of the guys who create the British TV show Red Dwarf. And when they are working together, when they create that show together, they are on fire. They are finishing each other's thoughts, they do everything else. Later, they both work on separate things. Those things are good. They're maybe not quite as good as when they're working together. And towards the end of the time, they have a bit of a rapprochement and work together again. So obviously, there will be Asterixes after the death of both men, ultimately. But it's very much the ones they're on together that really just show and capture that imagination. But it's not the first thing they work on together, is it?
No. So they create lots of comics, actually. They sort of are getting into a groove of working together. And most of these are lost to time. They create one of a Native American that they call Papa, who they pair with a 18th century aristocrat, French aristocrat. I noticed that you had his English name as Brussels sprout. In French, it translates to puff pastry. This did get published. It didn't necessarily go anywhere. Certainly fans know about it. They also wrote, they were employed to write a women's advice column on etiquette. That they had great fun with this. And Goscinny would sign it Liliane d'Orsay, and do things like advise that it's probably not a good idea to wipe your shoes on the curtains. The advice that got them completely shut down was when a woman wrote to say that she was having a CEO, a bishop, and a bishop come to dinner, and how should she seat them? And Goscinny's advice was on chairs.
Which again,
at that time, he says we would do anything. Yeah.
It just captures their humour, though, I think. That just absolutely captures the core of the humour.
But this is a period where Goscinny really lives in poverty.
And this effectively brings us to the beginnings of Asterix itself. So how, I like to think that you can see almost the lurking origins of that in Papa. You know, as you said, you can even see the lurking origins of the difficulty of translation in that, as you say, in French, the French aristocratic officer's character, who is not necessarily painted as this glorious, overarching, amazing figure. That's a parody figure in itself. If anything, it's Papa who is almost you can almost see the little tendrils and prototypes of what will become Asterix in that. But yeah, in the English version, he's Hubert Brussels Sprout, because clearly they're trying to go with actually what is a food joke we can make that is a reference to it. In the same way in France, it's the puff pastry thing. So, yeah, let's get to Asterix now. And listeners, you can punch the air as now we're getting to the bit. But hopefully you realize that you kind of need to understand where these guys are coming from to really know where it's going. So talk us through how Asterix comes to be as an idea.
So the long and the short of it is that they're now working for a different company called Eddy Press and Eddy France, which also supplies content. And the fellow who runs that company, a friend of theirs called Jean Hébrard, is a mate of another fellow called François Cloteau. Now, Cloteau worked for L'Oréal, but his real passion was a magazine that he'd read as a child called Benjamin in Brussels. And his dream was to create a French version of that, a magazine for children. And his idea was that it absolutely had to be called pilot. And he's looking for people to supply content. And he turns to his mate Jean, and he knows that Jean has these workers, and he thinks this is going to be perfect. These are the people I need. And he wants this to be very specifically French. So his instruction to Goscinny and Uderzo is create a comic that is specifically French. So their first thought is, oh yes, the novel of Renard. That's this medieval stories about a fox. They think this will be perfect. We'll anthropomorphize the animals, and then they find out that someone else is already doing that. So they have to go back to the drawing board. It's August. It's very hot. It's the last minute. They have to come up with something. They're sitting on the terrace of Uderzo's flat in Paris. They're smoking, they're drinking pastis. And Goscinny says to Uderzo, right, run through the historical periods. So Uderzo says cavemen. And Goscinny says, no, I don't think that's right. Then Uderzo says Gauls. And they stop. Because, and I can talk about this, but Gauls have a particular significance and resonance to the French. And they realize that Gauls have this specific kind of significance and resonance, and no one has written about them. So then Uderzo says, okay, so we'll have a pair, and the hero should be a big, strong bloke. And Goscinny says, no, he should be a little guy. Big, strong blokes aren't funny. I want him to be funny. Little guys are funny. But I tell you what, we'll give him a mate, and basically to assuage Uderzo, he says he can be big, and we'll make him a menu delivery man. And the way they describe it, and in the French press, this is described over and over and over because it's the foundation story. Then they realize, so then Goscinny says to Uderzo, and you can decide where we put them, but it has to be on the coast because I want them to be able to take the boat to go places. And Uderzo says, well, Uderzo during the war would spend time in Brittany to escape the obligatory work program that sent young Frenchmen to Germany. And he had these lovely memories of Brittany. So it was set in Brittany. And then they realized, of course, Romans. So then they create the Roman camps. Then they create the chief and the bard and the druid based on the things that they remember learning at school about Gauls. And they say within about half an hour, we had the whole basis of the story laid out.
Well, let's dig a bit into, as you say, the why did they stop when they hit Gauls? And as you say, why did it resonate so much?
From 1870 or 1871 to 1950, there was a primary school textbook, and every single French child in primary school, so millions of children over those years, learned the phrase, our ancestors were the Gauls. And they learnt about Vercingetorix, and it was written by a fellow called Ernest Lavis, and it was called Le Petit Lavis. And there were all sorts of pictures of Gaulish villages, of big, strong Gauls with broad shoulders and blonde plaits. And this is really significant. This book is developed in the wake of another national humiliation, which was the Franco-Prussian War. In the Franco-Prussian War, France is invaded by Germany and loses Alsace to Germany, and they don't get it back until after the end of World War One. And this is an enormous national humiliation. And this is a story. So this happens at a moment when primary school education becomes obligatory and is secular. And so this is a kind of uniting narrative. It is a narrative that is deliberately designed to bring together little children from Brittany, from the south of France, from the north of France, into this one narrative. And so Goscinny and Uderzo were children who went through the schooling system who learnt this. This kind of phrase, our ancestors, the Gauls, is available to every French person. And this is why they had also that knowledge at their fingertips. Romans, bards, druids, chiefs. So they understood what they said was that the Gauls were like our Wild West.
I think this is the thing for me, is like, one of the reasons I really wanted us to dig into this is I think it's a thing that would be really easy to overlook. And I always say that history doesn't repeat, as the saying goes, it echoes. And I think this is one of those wonderful connections you see in these kind of things where people are inspired by things that were also inspired by similar events. So what we end up with Asterix, and we'll talk a bit about its impact on post-war France, but it's in some ways a product of a similar impact in terms of national crisis that happened after the Franco-Prussian War. So listeners, you've got one of these historical echoes here. You know, the same thing that produces the textbooks, the education style that creates this Gaulish fascination after the Franco-Prussian War echoes again after another war against a Germanic people, this time the United Germanic people, to give us Asterix. And then that, like, we have to remember that this is it. History echoes. But yeah, so you've really described nicely how this comes together and where the characters come from. How does this get into print, and what happens after it gets into print?
So the very first issue of Pilote on page 20, and it's the fifth cartoon in the magazine, not the first one. There's a full page. The very first page, what becomes the very first page of the volume Asterix the Gaul. And every week they publish another page. So this is a weekly magazine. And so they're working very hard to get this ready every week. And very quickly this becomes popular and they start getting mail. And very quickly children start sending in drawings. If it doesn't appear one week, they get letters, besieged by letters asking where it's gone. The popularity comes very quickly. But at the same time, the magazine is going financially bankrupt and it's at the point of failure, and it's bought by another would-be publishing mogul, a fellow called Georges Dalgaud, for 1 franc. And he puts Goscinny in charge as editor. Dalgaud becomes the publisher of the volumes. So 1959 is the first issue of Pilote. 1961, Dalgaud decides he's going to bring out volumes of the comic series that are doing well in the magazine. So 1961, the very first volume, album of Asterix, and that's Asterix the Gaul, is published.
And for listeners who are unfamiliar with what other than the short bit I read at the beginning about how the English translations always start, Asterix as a series is very much about the Gauls holding out in this village in Brittany, fighting against the surrounding Romans. It is absolutely jam-packed with both history and humour. And we'll talk in a second about what form that humour takes. But it's aimed at children but it's not afraid to lean on literary and cultural references from outside of that, which what is really makes it fascinating, I think, as a cultural piece of history as much as anything else. But all of their adventures, as Judy's described, are as much about, it starts very much in that village and in the defense of that village, but Goscinny has always had this desire to do the things abroad. So you get Asterix in Britain, you get Asterix and the Goths, using the English names of these things. You get Asterix and the Black Gold, another one of my early purchases, which is effectively about them going to the Middle East and trying to find petroleum, as it's translated in English, which is the mysterious black ingredient that the druid uses in the potion that gives them extra and amazing strength. And that extra and amazing strength is how they can hold out against the mighty Roman Empire. As a massive swerve in that one I love, and spoilers if you've never read Asterix and the Black Gold, is they go on this massive mission to try and get this theme ingredient, get back and find that actually the Druids worked out how to replace it with something far tastier and they didn't need to go at all. And I just love that there's almost a Mad Magazine element to that, of just the entire book is effectively useless. They didn't have to do any of it. But that, in summary, gives you an idea of what their adventures are like. Asterix and Cleopatra, when they meet Cleopatra, all of these things kick in. And what they do is create opportunities for Asterix and Obelix to encounter other characters. And the humor comes from their observations both of themselves and their own culture and of the other cultures and the people from other cultures they're encountering. In the French originals, what form does that humor tend to take and what references does it pull on?
So lots and lots of puns. And Goscinny would say that he would stuff as many jokes as he could into the books. I think the characterization, he works on the characters themselves and the relationship between Asterix and Obelix. And the fishmonger, the running jokes, the fishmonger whose fish aren't fresh, the bard whose singing is off. And also then the characters and the premises of the story. My favourite is Asterix in Switzerland, I have to say, and the way he pokes fun at the Swiss. But he also stuffs it full of references, and I think that one of the reasons for the extraordinary success of the books is to think about them as a great big in-joke, because he has Uderzo draws actors who so in the books who people would recognise, TV hosts, and TV is brand new, so this is a big thing. So there's sometimes a figure pops up and it's clearly a cartoon drawing of someone who's well known. Jacques Chirac comes up at some point. So there's that. There are references to songs. There are Shakespearean references to films. So Asterix and Cleopatra is the whole opening section is a spoof on the film. You know, this many bottles of ink, this many hours drawing. If you know the beginning of the film, it's a similar sort of thing. So any kind of cultural reference that he could draw on, he would pull down into the books.
And yeah, I like Asterix and Cleopatra is a really good example for that. Like, as I say, it's one of my first, and so many of those jokes as a kid just go straight over your head. There's an entire, all the way through, there's references to her nose. But like, it's all of those references go through you, but it doesn't matter if you're a kid, because actually you're picking up the vibe, you're picking up the puns, and it's almost like there's an onion aspect to it. The reason I think they hold their relevance, the reason people still pick them up and read them now, is because it's almost as each time you age up, you almost unlock another layer of humor within those books. You can go back and read them now as an adult, and you will find things that genuinely make you laugh that you had not read as a kid. This explodes in popularity, as you've talked about, and we should spend a bit of time talking about what that actually has in terms of cultural and economic impact on France at the time. Because remember, listeners, we are still very much, at this point, we're talking early 60s, moving forward as these books are becoming incredibly popular. They're at a point where French culture, as it is in Britain in a similar way, is at a tipping point where economically the country's at a tipping point. maybe let's talk briefly about the economic side of this first, and then we'll dig into the cultural side. But what's the sort of the economic outcome of this?
So in the post-war, France is kind of behind the rest of Europe and the UK. It's still overwhelmingly rural. It doesn't have a great deal of industry, and it experiences, every country has its own name for it, right? In France, they're called the 30 Glorious Years. So really up until the oil shock of the mid-70s, where the economic leap ahead is extraordinary, but massive changes, massive urbanization, massive changes to farming and farming methods. So you have to think tractors, refrigerators, TVs, cars, huge kind of mechanization. And at the same time, then a kind of democratization of culture. So the transistor radio comes in at this time, and it's really, really important because rather than a whole family gathered round a great big heavy radio that has to be plugged in, young people can carry this thing around with them and listen to whatever they want to listen to. There's the advent of TV. So culture is kind of shifting also. And you get then also the rise of consumption and advertising and marketing, which are new things or take on new forms in the post-war. And the Asterix series rides this wave. So very quickly there are demands to use Asterix in advertising and merchandise. And they sign up to a brand new company that manages this. They charge companies a fortune to use Asterix, and he's never allowed to speak. You can only have his image. But, the laughing cow cheese, for example, so they pay up, and you also have to pay a proportion of your profits. They decide they put Asterix on the cover, and their sales go up 28%. Right, so Asterix becomes this hot property, and it can. And I mean, there's this story where in the same year it's used to sell butter and margarine. So one of the stories of the success of the series is that they really latch onto this, and they understand the significance of this, and as I said, they ride this wave.
And culturally, as you say, the reason they can ride this wave, in fact, actually, I'm going to absolute sidebar on this before we go into you talk about them becoming the face of effectively Laughing Cow cheese. This is another one of those wonderful historical ripples, because the reason Laughing Cow is called Laughing Cow cheese is because the guy behind it, that was what was painted on the side of the ambulance he drove when he was taking supplies to relieve the fort of Verdun in World War I. So again, you've got all these key moments in French cultural history almost combining up. But yeah, the reason it can ride this merchandising wave is the Asterix is one of the very first, what we would call now an audiobook. It's one of the first things to get a sort of audiobook version, then on a record. But why is it having why is it resonating so much with the French at the time?
So France in the immediate post-war, they're not in a good way. They have suffered a really humiliating defeat in 1940. They're overrun in about 3 weeks. And then they basically experience a civil war throughout the Second World War, and they have this highly effective collaborationist regime. And this is a really difficult past. They come out of the war and almost immediately from 1954 onwards into, first of all, a humiliating defeat in Indochina, and then a long drawn-out 8-year brutal war of independence in Algeria. So they have experienced national humiliation, and they are experiencing the loss of their colonies, which in itself is also a kind of sense of humiliation. Charles de Gaulle, who very quickly becomes president, basically puts in place a myth that the majority of the French resisted. He's trying to find a way to bind the French again, to find a kind of national narrative. But Asterix gives the French a workable past. Asterix lets them leap over the events of the Second World War and in a way to just completely forget about that, and instead to go right back to Gauls. And so part of the research for this book has been hundreds of newspaper articles about the books and reactions to the books in the press. And what is extraordinary is that the overwhelming story is people saying, well, of course, this is us. This is exactly who we are. So I think that it's for the French, it's a workable story. It's a story that gives them a kind of narrative of themselves that is comfortable. And of course, in Asterix, they are the colonized. They are not the colonizer. I think also this is kind of key as they're experiencing these brutal wars of decolonization. But also this is the moment when in the 60s, the French start to think of themselves or of France as the hexagon. So there's a kind of turning inwards. They no longer think of themselves as a great imperial power. They have to learn to think of themselves as a great nation, and de Gaulle really works on that. But again, Asterix serves that because he gives them a past that says, we were the, and all the narratives about them, yes, this is us, we were the plucky little guys, we stood up to the bullies, this kind of story. And it really is quite extraordinary, but the response, the kind of embracing of this is overwhelming.
It's a history and an era they can retrieve, as you say, because they're not the colonizers they're the being colonized. But they can retrieve it because it didn't exist in a way that could be co-opted by fascists in other ways, in a pre-war way. So I always think it's a really interesting comparison with Italy, because Italy does not have the ability in that period to go back to the Roman Empire and say, actually, let's remember how great we were as Romans, because Mussolini had already co-opted that in the pre-war environment for his Italian fascist narrative. So what Goscinny and Uderzo do, as you say, is they unlock an entire area of French history that French can go, actually, that's the bit we want to associate ourselves with now. That's the bit we're going to rebuild our myth on. And I think when you view it through that window, it's not hard to see why it just became so unbelievably popular in France. I mean, one thing I know you said to me is like, it's not really an exaggeration to say that every household in France has a full or near complete full set. And it must be an interesting one to do in your research, because you've got access to the Goscinny archive, and you say you've seen hundreds of newspapers, but you've talked to me as well about fan mail and just how much fan mail's there.
Yes. So it's extraordinary to work in a private archive, and it's the Goscinny archive is in a very chic part of Paris, on the Avenue Victor Hugo, which runs down from the Arc de Triomphe, and they have the publishing arm there of Nicholas, which is another Goscinny production. In English, I think it's called Little Nicholas, and it's just absolutely wonderful. And they have the archive and a full-time archivist. Goscinny's daughter, Anne, is also an author of children's books, so she has her offices there as well. And I was given access to his correspondence. And this includes general correspondence, all sorts of letters from very well-known people, and fan mail that he kept. And sometimes the most gloriously loopy fan mail, with people getting fully into the joke and completely identifying. One fellow who lives near Dijon styles himself as a Gaulish warrior and writes these letters in sort of completely co-opting ideas of Gaulish kind of ideas and language in, come and visit and park your chariot in the lane behind the house, and and we'll drink some hydromel to your health, and yes, so it is a wonderful read.
And so for the rest of the main part of this podcast, what I want us to get across to listeners, and we'll cover for you listeners, is I want to talk a bit about in brief about the process of translation, but also look at Goscinny's death and its impact on both France and the series. But listeners, if you really, really, really want to know about the remarkable English translations and the person behind them, we'll talk a bit about the two people behind them in a second. But also, if you really just want to geek out on some Asterix name puns, that stuff is going to be in the extra episode, because we just do not have time to cover everything we would dearly love to cover in the main bit. But we'll try and cover a little bit of that in the main podcast. But genuinely, you're going to have to get the extra bit if you want all of that. So with that warning in place, let's continue now and briefly look at the English translations, because obviously the first English translation comes in. Well, and this is translated everywhere in Europe. In particular, we should be clear on that. The English translations in particular are Andrea Bell, and I think it's Derek Hockridge, is it, who works with her on that? So she is a literary translator. She's a literary translator with a bit of a focus already by that point on children's books. But what she is she's incredibly talented and good at taking at the pun side of things. And one of the reasons for that is she's actually the daughter of Adrian Bell, who's the guy who effectively invents Times cryptic crossword. So she talked in later life about how one of the things that trained her in being a good translator, and particularly of works that need a bit of lateral thinking, is because Adrian used to practice on his cryptic crossword clues on her and her brother when they were sat at the breakfast table as kids. And her brother, by the way, for English listeners, you will also recognize the name of, because her brother was Martin Bell, who went on to become a legendary BBC journalist and broadcaster, and briefly an independent MP. So this is the family of the people who are creating this. But we also mustn't overlook Derek as well. So Derek Hockridge was at the time he was actually a professor at the University of Leicester, and his specialism was in French culture. So he was an English professor who was specializing in French culture and specializing in understanding things like that. So you can almost see why, as a pairing, you've got a literary translator who is pretty good at lateral thinking and therefore translating puns and references, combined with an expert in French literature and French society and French culture, creates the exact right combo for translating Asterix books. That to me is fascinating. There's almost an element of the right people coming together in the same way as Goscinny and others do, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. Translating Asterix is very difficult because it was written and because of what I think of as the in-jokes. Goscinny had a method. Well, first of all, Goscinny spoke fluent English and Spanish, so he could actually read the translations, but he would get the translations then translated back into French. And he would say if he understood the jokes, then the translation was no good, because the translation had to then speak in the vernacular. It had to have the in-jokes of the language it was translated into. And I've met people who were absolutely convinced that Asterix was written in German, for example, because it is for them so thoroughly German. Asterix sold easily as well in Germany, if not better, than it did in France.
But the German one's a really good example as well of how much care Goscinny put into making sure, as you say, those translations map to what he wants to get across, because he rejects the entire first German translation of it because he feels it's too nationalist.
Oh, well, there was in the 60s, there was a group who actually co-opted Asterix, and these were neo-Nazis, and made him an extreme right-wing figure, basically exacting revenge on the Slavic Eastern lands. Goscinny got the lawyers in to stop them.
Yeah, and I think that really sums up both how protective they were of the character, not just for economic reasons, but because they knew the cultural side of it was just as important, and they knew that making it reflect the cultural norms and the jokiness of the nation it was being translated in was just as important. And so the English translation as I say, we'll talk a lot more about the role that they play in this. But 1969 is the first time that comes out with the first translation of Asterix the Gaul. Enormously popular in English, just as much as it is in French. But one thing we'll briefly touch on here is it never really takes off in America, does it? And I've always wondered how much of that is. I mean, like if you look at the name examples and you say like the puns are so important to this in terms of names, in terms of everything else. And I think a really good example of this is, so the chief, who's obviously an important character in French, and I'm going to butcher this and I do apologize in advance, is I think it's Abraracorsix, which is effectively a double pun almost, because it's a sort of literally translates as with shortened arms.
It's
and he
when
does have little stubby
arms.
arms.
Like that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's the combo. It's almost like it's both a physical reference, and it's also that if you hold your arms up in front of yourself in a defensive position. So it's both it's a translation of a French idiom, but also a literal thing that works. And actually, when Bell and Hockridge translate this into English, they go, we can't really capture that second bit, but we can capture the first bit. So they go with actually becomes vital statistics, because they're like, right, well, actually, because he is very wide. So we can make a pun on the fact that actually it's his girth and that he is the stout defender. So it gets across the same idea as raising your arms in defense in a very similar way. But if you look at the first American translation of that character's name, it's macroeconomics. And it's like, well, there's no representation of that there. There's no capture of any of that. And have you looked much at the American side of things? Why do you think it didn't quite grab the Americans in the same way?
I think there's something about the humour. The French will say that it's very English humour. I think that as you said, I think you can see traces of the Kurtzman sort of Mad magazine humour. One of the things that they have in the archive is all the advertising, marketing material that was produced in the 1960s to try and break into the American market. And it's extraordinary because they talk about Asterix and his wacky friend Obelix. And that, I think, is really an extraordinary misrepresentation of the UK English translation and the original French. So it's trying to speak to a kind of American idea of humour, but the books don't work in that way.
And I've always wondered how much of that is because, as you say, like from an American perspective, they're trying to fit it into an existing framework of cartoons and comedy that people are used to. And if you look at, say, the debut of the Adventures of Rocky and Bullwinkle happens before this. And that, I think, is one of those things that you can almost see the Americans trying to go, well, we need to make it like that. We need to make it like that because that's what kids will get. They don't allow kids the sophistication. They don't go, it's okay if this joke washes over someone. I mean, the last thing, and maybe we'll touch on in translation, the main podcast is there's a fascinating account. We'll link to it in the show notes that Andrea Bell wrote called Asterix, My Love, which is an article she wrote about her joy in translating it throughout her life. But she describes in there the extent they go to get these things right. And she talks, for example, about, so in Le Cadeau de César, so Caesar's gift is the English version of that. Goscinny's put a whole running joke through an innkeeping scene where Asterix effectively slips into the character of Cyrano de Bergerac as he's fighting a sword duel with a Roman while composing a ballad. And as you said back to the beginning about the influences on Goscinny is like, it includes quotations from like Rostand, so Cyrano's creator, and they're just thrown around in this sword fight. Some of those maybe are going to get a French kid's going to get, or they're going to guess the kind of thing that it is, but they're not going to get everything. But when they translate that into English, they're not just there going, well, let's just blanket translate that. They could go, but let's just make that Cyrano de Bergerac as well. It's vaguely known. But they don't. They effectively went, well, what's the most famous literary sword fight in English? And so if you read the English version, it's effectively littered with Shakespearean quotes. It's effectively it's from Hamlet. It's Hamlet and Laertes. And it's all the innkeeper's wife sort of advises her husband, act with disdain, and the Roman can then say, I am more an antique Roman than a Dane. These are the care that's gone into that translation is huge. And we'll talk a bit more about that in the extra episode. But we should get to the tragedy of Goscinny's death, because he dies incredibly young, doesn't he?
Yes, he was 51. So November 1977, he's doing a stress test in the cardiologist's office, and he has a massive heart attack.
Which, dark as it is, I do have to say, is I think it's exactly the way he would have wanted to go based on his sense of humour.
Possibly, although maybe not quite so young.
Not quite so young, definitely.
Yes. And this is he dies in his wife's arms. This is a profound shock, a deep and profound shock. And headlines the next day, Asterix and Obelix have been orphaned. Asterix has lost his daddy. All of Gaul is in mourning. So fully in, and one of the things that's so fascinating about the French response is the slippage. Like, there are people, or the way they write and talk about this, it's almost as though they believe this is real. And you can see from the headlines that effect also, because they're quite serious, these headlines. Not Goscinny dies, that's the description in the article, but Asterix and Obelix have been orphaned. And this is, I mean, again, just countless newspaper articles and headlines. So the shock and the grief are really profound. In Le Monde, they say, so it's a major centrist newspaper, Goscinny was to comics what the Eiffel Tower is to Paris.
We do need to also remember that with Uderzo, they're huge friends. They are so much a part of each other's lives, and just the absolute trauma that creates, not just for his family, but for Uderzo as well, who's now left in that situation of being almost the sole guardian of the characters they had created together, and the angst that must have created in him about, do you continue this? Do you not continue this? And I think that's reflected as well, isn't it, in the arguments at the time, is like, what happens now?
Well, so Asterix in Belgium was half done, and he absolutely did not want to continue. And he was completely broken by Goscinny's death. And Georges Dargaud, so the publisher, actually legally forced him to finish the volume, and he never forgave that. And when he could, he sold the rights to the Asterix volumes. They now belong with the French publisher Hachette. And that's a bit tricky because it's now owned by the extreme right publishing mogul, Vincent Bolloré, but that's another story. So he's forced to finish that volume, and he takes a couple of years, and eventually he decides that Goscinny would have wanted him to continue, and that's when he goes on and does several volumes where he does illustrations, but also writes text.
And as you say, that the thing with Asterix in Belgium is, listeners, if you've got a copy or you can find a copy in the library, go have a look at it, because you can see in that the sadness, the profound sadness. Because when you get to page 32, I think it's 32 or 33, beyond that, the colour of the sky changes. So he doesn't draw a blue sky in that comic after that point. Everything beyond that is grey skies, it's rain, and that's a deliberate mark of the point that that's how far they'd got together before he died. And right at the end, if you look in the lower left corner of the final panel, you'll see a small rabbit sort of, and it's sadly walking towards Goscinny's signature and looking at it, because it's heartbreaking as an adult reading that book again, because you can feel the grief coming off the page. And I think there's obviously Asterix continues beyond that. It continues even beyond Uderzo's death, and that in itself is somewhat controversial. But I think the general agreement is they were a pair that were at their peak together, and the later work was also good. But I just think Asterix in Belgium stands as that real marking point. If you have never read any, don't read that one first. Go read Asterix the Gaul. Go read whatever one on the shelf looks and takes your fancy. But then make the second one you read Asterix in Belgium, because I think you really capture the emotional relationship between the two men in that. Well, look, thank you very much for joining me on the main episode of the podcast. I know it's a while before the book comes out, but where can people follow you, find you to make sure they're up to date when the book does come out? Because I don't think there can be many people who haven't listened to this episode who can't now hopefully understand the historical context of Asterix and why it's important. So where can people find you online?
So I have an official page at Monash University, but I'll be sure to post repeatedly on Blue Sky. And I'm just Julie Kalman on Blue Sky when the book comes out. It's due, so it's being published by Princeton University Press, and it's due there next March, and I'm working very hard to get it done, which means that with a bit of luck, it'll be out either very late 2027 or first thing 2028.
Amazing. Well, look, I'm going to give the last word here to Anthea, because I think as translator, I think she said something years ago that I think really captures the spirit of these books. But Extras listeners, hang around because we're going to talk more about Asterix. You absolutely want the extra bit on this one. So much more we can talk about and we'll talk about. Listeners who aren't members, don't forget you can get access to those at untitled-history.com. You can sign up there. That's going to get you ad-free episodes. It's going to get you the extra bits. It's going to get you all the weird stuff I post between them, which is random history things I find on YouTube and papers and articles and stuff that you might find interesting or a good weekend watch. So sign up there. And if you've enjoyed this episode, please remember that it's really, really hard for us to get this podcast in front of people, harder than it is for most history podcasts, precisely because we're trying to bring you stories like this. We're trying to not cover exactly the same thing that's been trodden over thousands of times on YouTube and Spotify to bring you unique content. But the positive of that is it's great to listen to, we hope. The negative is it makes it really hard for things like YouTube or Spotify to know how to recommend us to people. So word of mouth is huge for us. Spread the word. If you've enjoyed this, if you know an Asterix fan, send them this link. If you know a French cultural historian, send them this link. Pop it on WhatsApp. Talk about it on Blue Sky or Mastodon or X if you really have to, Instagram and TikTok, but share the message and get the story out. But extra listeners, you're going to really enjoy the extra bit on this one. But for main episode listeners, I'm going to leave you with the words of Anthea Bell, one of the, as I say, the key figure in translating the English versions, because I think she captures Asterix entirely. And so years ago, she wrote this: I would call the comedy not solely French, but European. French children's history books traditionally open with a tribute to nos ancêtres les Gaulois.
Nos ancêtres les Gaulois.
There you go. You're far better at saying it than me. Seller and Yeatman's book 1066 and all that, the sort of the English comedy history book that was so influential. And the television series Up Pompeii and Blackadder are in the same tradition. All of us in Europe enjoy making anachronistic fun of the past. I think that absolutely encapsulates what makes these books great. So thank you for joining me on this adventure so far, Julie. Hopefully you've enjoyed it as well.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Perfect. In which case, we will now carry on to the extra bit, and extra listeners, we will see you there. You've been listening to the Untitled History Podcast, a Battle Guide production. If you've enjoyed this episode and would like to support the podcast, why not head over to our dedicated supporter page? There, for the cost of a cup of tea, you can decide which subjects we cover next, get access to exclusive behind-the-scenes content, and join a community of like-minded people. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.